Hey, Dr. John. Recently, we've had a number of clients who have suffered carpal fractures in the wrist. Is that significant?
Yes, Mark. Carpal fractures can be significant injuries.
Now, are you qualified to talk about carpal fractures?
My education, training, experience has let me identify, diagnose, and treat carpal fractures.
And can you please help us understand the anatomy of the wrist as it relates to a carpal fracture?
Sure, Mark. Let's take a look at this first slide. In this slide, first on the left side, what we're looking at is a hand with an overlying carpal bones inside. And when we take that part of the carpal bones and magnify it in a bigger rectangular piece, we can actually see the several parts of the carpal bones. The carpal bones are made up of the scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, hamate, capitate, trapezoid, and trapezium.
What is the function of the carpal bones in the hand?
So the carpal bones provide structure to our wrist. They allow motion, they allow attachment of various ligaments, and they provide strength when we're trying to grip.
What types of symptoms can our clients anticipate experiencing if they suffer a carpal fracture in their hand?
So symptoms related to a fracture are primarily pain, loss of movement, and typically loss of strength in many cases.
Hey, Dr. John, how do carpal fractures occur?
So carpal fractures occur typically after in a slip and fall on an outstretched hand. Now they can occur with various mechanisms. One can be a direct impact to the fracture, which creates the break in the bone. But another way that you can fracture the bone is through something called an avulsion fracture. In order to understand the mechanism of injury in carpal fractures, let's just take a look at one example. This next example is an example of what's called an avulsion fracture. When we look at this particular slide, we can see that the carpal bones have ligaments attached to them. Now, ligaments you can't see on x-rays. So when there's a fracture, sometimes what that means is that a ligament has pulled a part of the bone off where it's primarily attached. And in this slide, you can see there's something called a dorsal radiocarpal ligament. There's a dorsal intercarpal ligament, and that attaches to the triquetrum. When sufficient force has occurred, such as after a fall, the ligament actually pulls on the bone and does what's called an avulsion of that bone, meaning a part of the bone has been removed from its main portion or main body.
How do you diagnose these carpal fracture injuries?
The primary way to diagnose them is through a complete history, physical examination, and then x-ray imaging. Remember, x-rays are really good for looking at bones. But sometimes when these fractures are quite small, an MRI can also be helpful to identify these fractures.
Who is the right type of professional to treat and diagnose a carpal fracture injury?
Carpal fractures are best identified and treated by an orthopedic surgeon.
When our clients suffer a carpal fracture injury, what does the future look like for them? What kinds of treatments can they anticipate needing?
The type of treatment that an individual may face after sustaining a carpal fracture depends on which bone has been fractured and how much displacement has occurred. In some cases, such as with some triquetral fractures, you can treat them with brace or cast immobilization. But there are some carpal fractures where the displacement or how far apart the fracture is located results in the need for surgery to put the pieces back together. And some cases, because the blood supply can be quite tenuous or sometimes very difficult in these smaller bones, if the bone sustains what's called avascular necrosis, where the blood supply is lost, some other more complicated surgeries can then be required.
Are these procedures likely to resolve the problem for our clients when they've suffered a carpal fracture?
It depends on the severity of the fracture. In fractures in which there's not very much displacement or the fractured pieces are close together, typically you can expect pretty good healing. But in cases where ultimately the blood supply is lost, then you can have sustained some long-term consequences.
Thank you, doctor.
You're welcome, Mark.